Hey, and welcome into a dive into Delve's DPS tier list with a few tips for each class. So, I've been playing World of Warcraft The War Within pretty extensively since it came out, and one of my favorite new features of WoW's newest expansion has been the Delve system. I've been running a lot of Delves, and pretty much at least dabbled in every class and spec, with DPS being the most popular role, with most players engaging with the content in that way. I thought I'd rank the DPS due to my experience with them in Delve content, but I don't want to just do a simple tier list and paint the picture that some DPS are just all around better than others, although you could make the argument that there are some, without at least addressing some aspects and strengths for each class and spec that makes them interesting and fun when running through this content. I'll be breaking up the Delves into four main categories. The S tier category for classes or specs that can pretty much just steamroll Delves. Classes that you can really just turn your brain off and just rampage your way through. A tier are classes that are quite strong and have a lot of damage, defenses, and utility, and are just all around really effective, but might have a few issues with their kit or playstyle that requires a bit more effort, or that you at least should be wary of. B tier are classes that while they might be strong in some areas, they simply have a few aspects of their kit that hold them back, and require a bit more reliance on our buddy Bran to get through, and just have to plan more stringently in order to have an efficient run. And finally, the C tier are classes that just have at least one aspect that really makes them either unfun or just awkward and rough to delve with a heavy dependence on Bran. Most classes have specs that don't really massively differentiate in effectiveness and are largely personal preference, but if there are any massive exceptions, I'll group the two specs differently. Starting off with the heavies, the plate wearers, the first class up is the warrior. The warrior class, with the fury and arm specs, have very similar damage profiles with fairly strong 45 to 90 second cooldowns. And all their hero talents are fairly competitive and have, again, very similar damage profiles. Second Wind is very effective to keep you topped between pulls or even during downtime on bosses, or, of course, if you have to run for your life. But you won't have to do that very often, as plate armor plus the option of defensive stance gives you a lot of protection against burst damage and getting one-shots. Your cooldowns are relatively short and enough to be up consistently, but strong enough and easy enough to use to absolutely decimate packs. And Spell Reflect is extremely godly against many enemies, especially the boss of Earthcrawl Mines. I do believe Fury slightly beats out Arms due to a more versatile defensive utility with Bloodthirst and Enraged Regeneration healing, with all the extra Bloodthirst that go off during your Blade Storm, thanks to your talent choice, and it essentially gives you a full heal during the cooldown. They do have a few downsides, however. Their main defensive cooldown, whether you're playing Arms or Fury, has a moderately long cooldown, around a minute and a half, and their healing is very dependent on either getting kills for impending victory or not getting hit for second wind, which does make them slightly dependent on Bran's potions for consistent survivability, and Spell Reflect, as good as it is, simply can't stop multiple enemies casting on you. Overall, I place warriors in the solid A tier for their strong AoE burst, decent access to at least some damage pacing, and a fair amount of mobility. Plus, the overall strength of their kit and abilities such as Spell Reflect really helps them stand out, with their only real weakness of having no access to easily skip unnecessary mobs and some lack of consistent healing sustain. The next plate wearer is the Ret Paladin, and this class has almost everything. Strong on-demand burst on relatively short cooldowns, strong consistent healing, forget to push a defensive and drop low, bam, instant full heal. Need an immunity? You got two. They are relatively long cooldowns, but Paladins are plate wearers with strong self-healing, and while they may not have massive mobility, you still in an emergency, if you gotta go fast, you could pop a horse. I prefer the Templar hero talent when you can smash things with a hammer and it simply goes away. Paladins really only have one weakness, and that's they have no real way to skip mobs if they don't need, but when you can either just chain pull them in or blow them up on demand, it's not much of a weakness. And the Ret Paladin, because of this, winds up as the first S-tier DPS class. The final plate wearer is the Death Knight. Both Frost and Unholy are high damage in both burst and sustain, but what really makes them stand out is just how unkillable they are. Will of the Necropolis is probably one of the most OP defensive passive abilities available to DPS, and how it interacts with death strikes enables them to ping-pong their HP up and down without any real reliance on Brand's potions or even their own strong defensive cooldowns. I'd recommend Rider of the Apocalypse hero talents, as not only do the horsemen offer further damage mitigation, but they really enable you to go full lazy mode, especially as Unholy. Pop your cooldowns and watch your army annihilate everything, and often despite doing around 1,000,000 DPS just because of how the threat is generated, Brand might actually wind up tanking a bit for you. And with Blood Plague ticking away as well, you rarely even need to Death Strike. Just run around collecting things and handling the delve objectives while your army wipes the floor with the mobs for you. And with your Death Charger, you even have the mobility for it. Which leads me to place the Death Knight, especially as Rider of the Apocalypse Unholy, to be a strong S tier. And that's not even touching the power of Anti-Magic Shell, the grouping power of A-Bomb Limb when you really want to nuke whole packs. Next, we move on down to the Malewares, starting with the Shaman, and Shamans are actually kinda hard for me to place, because they have really powerful cooldowns for both Enhancement and Elemental, and both offensively and defensively. And when your cooldown's up, you really feel like an unkillable god. Earth Elemental's the tank, a strong shield with Stone Bulwark Totem, and even a whopping 60% damage mitigation cooldown in Astral Shift. And your AoE is especially strong as Elemental. And Enhancement, which has a bit more consistent damage profile, and Strong Burst as well, can make you feel like a god when everything is up. However, it does have a bit of an issue with the fact that it's just not consistent. 2 minutes or longer cooldowns can feel a bit awkward in delves. They feel either a bit too strong for some pulls, and then you don't have anything for the next few. And while your defensives are really powerful, you just won't have them up very consistently due to how long their cooldowns are. Elemental especially suffers from having very long cooldowns and being fairly dependent on them. While delves aren't timed and there's nothing stopping you from simply waiting your cooldowns, it does heavily cut down on the efficiency of your runs. And when you have nothing up, and your damage, while not bad, the damage profile just doesn't really fit bursting mobs down in a few early seconds of a pull. And outside your defensive cooldowns, you're really dependent on Brand's potions just to stay alive. And while I almost put Shamans in the A tier just because of how powerful they can be in their cooldowns, their lack of consistent burst, consistent defensiveness, dependency on Brand, and just having to plan out and play around your cooldowns so precisely is why I put them in the B tier. Next up, the Hunter. Having a pet that tanks damage for you is absolutely a godsend. Many mob and boss mechanics are utterly trivialized simply by holding the mobs away from you, and many pulls wind up feeling like you're just wailing on target dummies, simply with an occasional extra global of men pet thrown in. And while Marksmanship's access to a consistent percent of HP base shield from their Sentinel hero talent tree, and Survival's has very strong initial burst, nothing really beats simply having an army of pets tanking everything for you while being completely mobile, making Beast Mastery the most efficient spec of the class. And while their damage is not seemingly exemplar, nor is it particularly bursty, it is very simple and consistent, and with all three specs not feeling too cooldown dependent. In addition, Hunters have access to camouflage, enabling them to skip their way through a delve on most things that they just don't need, and even if that fails, Feign Death also can work as a skip, although sometimes Brand takes a bit of convincing. Hunters make excellent use of a specific delve buff that boosts up your HP, as it will also double your pet's health, and since you aren't actually tanking, the buff almost never falls off. Misdirect can help you throw threat on either Bran or your pet, which is much more essential for Marksmanship or Survival than Beast Mastery, which makes Hunters' lack of strong defensive options almost a moot point. You don't really need them. Men pet on your pet is really all you need. It's really hard to die as a Hunter unless you completely fall asleep at the wheel, making them strong in almost everything you might want for a delve, making them a fairly solid S-tier class. I might drop Survival down to A just due to melee vulnerabilities and not being able to fully take advantage of pet tanking the mob away from you, but I don't think it's different enough to warrant dropping them down consistently. The final male wearer, the Evoker, I recommend Scale Commander hero talents as Deep Breath, Power, and more hover utilities extremely useful in delves. Blasting your way like a carpet bombing warplane will never not be fun, and hovering around while disintegrating just feels awesome. Renewing Blaze is a really strong defensive on a 1 minute cooldown, which also feels great to press, and Landslide can really help lock down those melee classes that you're trying to kite. And having a plate wearer's level of armor is also nothing to sneeze at as well. However, there are some weaknesses to the class. Their ability to top themselves outside of Renewing Blaze is really sparse, and the Blaze itself doesn't fully protect you with high enough burst to just instant kill you. And while their Obsidian Scale helps with that, it really doesn't make you invincible. And overall, you're extremely dependent on Brand's potions pretty consistently, and unfortunately the high mobility of the Evoker plays against that, as you will probably frequently find yourself having to keep track of where Bran is chucking his potions just to stay alive. And while being able to hover can help make some skips in some areas, it's not perfect. And your main cooldown being a 2 minute often feels like it's either too much for some pulls, but just not enough consistently, except for the bosses. And because of these issues, I wound up placing the Evoker in the B tier. Next up are the leatherwearers, and we'll start with rogues. Rogues have the strongest stealth in the game for delves, being the only class that can completely skip anything that they don't want to, due to stealth and sap, as the stealth detectors can simply be sapped and then walked by. Throwing tricks of the trade on Bran is also extremely useful, but watch out using it on bosses, as they'll often despawn if you have it active for the first hit. Subtlety and Assassination I strongly recommend, as their strong single target with strong cleave is one of the best damage profiles for delves. And Sub has a relatively short cooldowns up consistently, with a few stronger cooldowns for the really big pulls, and Assassination almost feels like it doesn't even need their cooldowns. Assassination especially feels like it has everything it needs, having easy cleave with caustic splatter, iron wire to silences to group up mobs faster, strong dots if you need to kite, and in general for all specs just vanish in a case of emergency to throw things on Bran yet again. Bran can be a bit awkward with this, sometimes vanishing himself, sometimes continuing to fight, so be careful. And even just doing delve objectives can be pretty easy by just throwing threat on Bran and running around and collecting whatever you need to collect. And rogues have almost no real dependency on their defensive cooldowns, which really offsets their short duration and long cooldown, and you can just use them in emergencies rather than having to consistently use them to survive pulls. Outlaw, unfortunately, is missing a lot of the early pull burst that some of the other two specs have, and have a bit more awkward cooldowns that's dependent on needing to stay in constant combat in order to shorten them enough to be competitive, which makes some of the other weaknesses of the spec feel worse, such as their long defensive cooldowns, as rogues really want to play around their stealth in delves and not be in constant combat, so I don't recommend Outlaw, and while some of the weaknesses of rogues might place them in B tier, however their strengths more than make up for them. Their stealth and versatility, and just how they deal damage with their damage profile, and ability to take easier advantage of Bran with tricks makes up for it, easily placing them in A tier for sub and assassination. However, since rogues don't really have the defenses for strong sustained combat, which makes them very dependent on Bran's potions for survival, it makes Outlaw's damage profile, coupled with their awkward offensive cooldowns for how delves function, it really just makes Outlaw feel quite bad to play in a delve. And the damage profile just plays against the rogue's general strengths. If I was considering combat-related powers of just Outlaw, maybe it really should be renamed back to combat, I would probably place it in the C tier, so I strongly don't recommend this spec unless you have a strong personal preference to it. Next up, the Monk. And monks have a lot of really strong tools in their arsenal. Extreme mobility, decent burst, and although it does take a few globals to set up, and almost every button they push feels impactful. Touch of Death is a strong on-demand button, and they have several decent defensives to keep themselves alive. In addition, Paralyze and Ring of Peace, or Pararop, can actually let you skip some mobs that you don't need, which lets them much easier play around their offensive cooldowns. Touch of Karma and Touch of Death can make really short work of some of the stronger and bigger enemies in delves, and Free Vivifies, which are further enhanced by the Shadowpan hero talents, give you a bit of on-demand healing, as well as any healing or chi spheres that drop during combat or on kills, making monks feel pretty strong and pretty fun. There are a few downsides, however. Their flat value healing is just often not enough in larger pulls, plus their relative squishiness as leather wearers means they take a lot of auto damage, and unfortunately while they hit rather hard, they just don't have the instant burst to just blow up packs easily, requiring at least a bit of setup, and their main defensive cooldowns just are too long to be up for every pack, and they definitely can be even overwhelmed even on the big packs, making it rather difficult to mass pull runes. And it really lowers the value of their larger cooldowns, especially their 2-minute cooldowns to win. Overall, their dependence on Brand's healing and having to plan and carefully use their abilities and defensives, and the fact that their damage, while strong and consistent, just doesn't really make up for their defensive weakness, leads me to place them in as a strong B tier. Next we have Druids, which is another stealth class, which gives a lot of easy freedom to pull what you want and skip the stuff you don't need. Boomkin is probably the most efficient mass AoE in the game, capable of hitting mobs 45 yards in a circle all around you, enabling them to begin AoEing even very spread out mobs much faster than any class. In addition, Boomkin Druids have Treants, which can tank for them, Ursouls to hold melee mobs away, and tons of fast burst damage from long-range Convoke and Celestial Alignment, giving them pretty consistent strong burst damage for most pulls in a delve. Starfall and Star Surge being instant make them decently mobile, and their damage profile is quite strong for how delve functions. Feral, on the other hand, is a dot class that, while it has strong dots, also has strong burst, making them a bit of a jack of all trades and a master of none, requiring a bit of setup in order for it to actually do its burst and to be able to do consistent damage, and there's very little leeway for mistakes. In addition, Druid in general has pretty poor defensives, and no really great way to shoot their own HP back up if they drop low. Frenzied Regen can only do so much, and Feral as melee really doesn't get to take advantage of some of the other aspects of the Druid kit. Druids just feel really squishy with little options other than to rely on Brand's potion, and unfortunately, since Feral lacks the burst damage to consistently deal with the packs before their poor defenses really come into play, and having to play around a 2-minute burst window does feel a bit awkward, although stealth does make up for that a bit. Boomkin is just much stronger, able to kite and have Treants to tank and easier to use burst, making them a fairly comfortable B tier. But Feral just feels pretty awkward to use and really hurts from poor defenses as being melee, and making it the second C tier class. Unfortunately, even for Boomkin Druids, defenses really do hold them back despite their access to stealth and strong offensive abilities, which would keep them from a higher tier. Finally, for the last leatherware, Demon Hunters. Demon Hunters have strong consistent burst damage, a very powerful 2-minute cooldown that lasts for a decent period of time, somewhat offsetting the 2-minute awkwardness, and the 30-second strong burst, and perhaps the most powerful, their offensive cooldowns are also their defenses, granting them strong leech and self-healing. Their main AoE, Blade Dance, also grants them a shield, further mitigating damage, and their extreme mobility gives them a lot of options to make large pulls and survive them. Their ease of play is definitely one of their strong points, as you don't really have to think about defensives too much. You simply mass pull and go crazy, and you feel pretty indestructible. And with access to glide and dashes plus imprison, you can find some mobs to even skip that you don't really need to pull. Overall, they are, however, a leather-wearing class, so without your cooldowns they can feel a bit squishy, especially if you're a bit under-geared and don't have the health pool yet, which is a bit of a weakness, which definitely prevents me from comfortably listing them in the S tier, but I still think they make a pretty solid A tier class. Finally, we're down to the Clothies, which, starting with the Shadow Priest, is definitely not as squishy as you might think, having access to strong priority damage, strong self-healing, either a consistent 30-second burst window with Void Weaver, or a longer-lasting 2-minute burst window with Archon. Their damage profile feels fairly strong, with the long duration of Archon making up for the awkwardness of a 2-minute cooldown, especially with their priority damage with Psychic Link and how they can AoE even when the mobs aren't grouped up with manual application of their dots. The real strong point of Priest, however, lies with their abilities Mind Soothe and Fade, effectively turning them into a stealth class that can rival rogues. Unfortunately, they can't easily get past the stealth detectors, but with a combination of Fade and Mind Soothe, they can get right up to groups of mobs and handle delve objectives without pulling, enabling them to skip and pull whatever they need, further offsetting the usual awkwardness of 2 minutes. Fade's usefulness doesn't end there, as it throws the threat on Bran for a full 10 seconds on only a 20-second cooldown, so 50% of the time, you're just not face tanking any mobs. And with a bit of distance from Bran, melee can barely get to you before you can simply use it again.
Watch your step.
This enables you to not even fully depend on Bran's potion, making you have very few weaknesses. That being said, priests are still clothies, and with heavily spread out mobs, they do have to manually apply their dots quite frequently, and while not being able to fully turret to do damage, they do have a bit of mobility during cooldowns with instant casts, but they aren't fully mobile. I almost would put them in the S tier with all of their power in their kit, but the amount of attention you have to pay to setting up your dots, setting up each pull, playing around Fade, and the frenzy of trying to keep Void Form going, sometimes requiring positioning and chain pulling, I can't quite say they're a class that lets you turn your brain off fully. But they're definitely pretty close, and do have a strong argument for being S tier. But overall, I wound up making them the strongest A tier. Next, we have a Warlock, a class that really makes you feel unkillable. First off, especially for Demonology, your pet is always tanking. And you can use Bran's potions to occasionally heal it fully, removing the necessity of health funneling it, which makes keeping your pet up pretty easy. But due to the strength of Soul Leech, you often don't even really massively need to do that. And Soul Leech makes you quite tanky and strong as well. And if that wasn't enough, you have several strong defensives, and Demonic Hellstones, especially empowered with Soulburn, can just fully heal you. And just like with Hunters, having your pet tank removes having to deal with many mob and boss mechanics, utterly trivializing one of the more awkward bosses in the Underkeep. Your pets are often so strong you can just fire them out and, just like Death Knights, then proceed to ignore the fight and handle delve objectives, as the mobs will eventually die. Running as Affliction with the Hellcaller hero talents gives you access to a strong permanent dot that you never have to reapply. Simply fire and forget. Some slow-moving mobs will eventually die from them if you just kite them out. Warlocks quickly find themselves in a position where you feel like you're just fighting target dummies, barely having to pay attention. And even if you do get a bit lazy and make a mistake, just make sure at the start of the delve to keep yourself Soulstoned and you can pop right back. Demonic Gateway can enable some skips, although it's not quite fully reliable, but locks definitely meet the requirement of turning your brain off, making them a fairly solid S tier. Destruction does lag a bit behind in utility, requiring more constant effort to do damage and being dependent on mobs sitting still in one spot, but I don't think they're weaker by enough to warrant dropping them a full tier, as most of what makes a Warlock strong is still applicable. Finally, we get to the Mage, and I actually wound up a bit surprised when playing with a Mage. I had initially assumed that mages would feel quite weak, as much of my past experience with mages indicated that in solo content, they really weren't very strong. However, mages have several strong things going for them. Fairly consistent strong damage that isn't massively dependent on long cooldowns, or with cooldowns that are frequently up, strong priority damage with decent cleave, strong kiting, slows, access to invisibility to be able to skip mobs, tons of roots, and access to even polymorph to at least snag a delve objective without having to stop and fight it. At least initially. Fire especially pulls ahead, as Frostfire still gives you access to slows, they have extremely strong burst that is fully mobile, frequent cooldown use with the cooldown reduction you get, and almost more importantly, a cheat death and cauterize, which definitely shores up the weakness of being a squishy clothy. All that said, they still are a squishy clothy, and despite the plethora of defensive cooldowns, they do take a bit of playing around in order to make sure that you can keep yourself alive. And are, as you would probably guess, fairly dependent upon Bran's healing, as Mage's own self-healing is virtually non-existent. In addition, Frost and Fire, which definitely feel a bit stronger alternatives to Arcane and Delves, are a bit dependent on mobs sitting still in a group, which, as mages who use a lot of kiting for defensive purposes, is a bit awkward, as some mobs definitely move faster and charge towards you much quicker than others. And since invisibility tends to be better used as a skip than a defensive, you wind up losing that defensive option. I feel like they're a fairly solid B tier, and Fire's especially fully mobile cooldowns with Scorch as an execute and a movement buff feels really strong to take advantage of, but all three setbacks seem at least fairly usable and seem fairly decent, at least in the low B tier. In conclusion, most classes feel pretty decent in delves with a variety of strengths, and making running delves with them pretty fun and interesting. And while there may be a few outliers being either ridiculously strong or feeling fairly weak, for the most part, every class has at least something about them that makes them pretty unique and fun. And with a variety of challenges offered by delves, there's also a lot of variance in how strong the classes can be in each different delve. Some delves have large numbers of mobs, incentivizing classes and specs that can survive mass pulling. Others have objectives that stealth can completely trivialize. Still, others are pretty paced, meaning that more consistent damage and defenses are pretty strong. And depending on the delve, this tier list can pretty much wildly fluctuate. And even a player's personal playstyle can impact this, as players can utilize strategies such as death running, or utilizing brand to hold threat while you handle the objectives, or even just pacing yourself and waiting for your cooldowns if you're not in any particular hurry. Delves, I believe, have been one of the better new additions to WoW in recent years, and while there definitely could be some more work done on them to balance them some more for player enjoyment, I've had a blast running and gearing a plethora of characters, and definitely enjoyed the fact that very few specs have felt unfun or unviable in them. Let me know if you agree with my tier list, and let me know if you disagree with it, or if there's anything that I might have missed that might make a class particularly stronger. Thanks for watching.